In April of 1972, Wendell Pemberton stood at the south fence of his 240 acres in Calhoun County, Kansas, and watched a 24-ton Mack tandem axle dump truck back across the line he had walked every spring for 41 years. The truck was the third one that morning. The first had come at 7:14, the second at 8:02, and this one was unloading now at 9:38. And the man who had ordered them there was sitting on the running board of a green Chevrolet Blazer parked on the gravel turnaround, with one boot on the ground and the other resting on the rocker panel. His name was Curtis Threadgill. He was 38 years old, the new county extension agent out of the Belfry office, and he had a blue ballpoint pen clicked open in one hand and a clipboard with 3 carbon paper forms in the other. "Well, Mr. Pemberton," Threadgill said, and he was smiling the way a man smiles when he has already filled in the blanks on a form before he's asked the question. "Looks like the Halverson Briggs people did exactly what their permit said they could do. 63 acres of overburden disposal site, right on the line, nothing in the statute that says they had to ask you twice." The dump truck released its load. 22 tons of slag, black-gray crushed waste rock from the strip mine pit a half-mile west along Kettle Creek, slid down the bed and hit the field with a long, flat sound that was not quite a roar and not quite a sigh, and the dust came up off the south field in a brown-gray cloud that rolled north on the April wind and settled on the new green of the winter wheat behind him like ash. Wendell Pemberton stood on his side of the fence and said nothing. He was 67 years old. He was wearing a faded tan canvas work jacket over a chambray blue shirt and faded blue Wranglers, and his right hand rested on the top wire of the woven fence, and his left hand held a small, greasy pocket notebook bound shut with a red rubber band. The notebook had belonged to his grandfather, Thaddeus Pemberton, who had farmed the same 240 acres from 1908 to 1947, and on page 31 of that notebook, dated October of 1934, in pencil that had not faded, was a procedure for amending what Thaddeus had called the dead lot, 18 acres on the north side of the place that a coal cinder hauler had buried in clinker waste in the spring of 1933. Thaddeus had brought it back. It had taken him 6 years. By 1940, the dead lot was producing 41 bushels of wheat per acre, which was 4 bushels above the county average for that year. Wendell Pemberton had read that page so many times he could recite it. He said nothing. Curtis Threadgill drove out one more time in May with a second offer, $204 an acre, $12,852 total, and Wendell signed nothing and said nothing and walked the man back to his Blazer with his hands in his pockets. In the Belfry feed and supply on the courthouse square 2 Wednesdays later, Curtis Threadgill stood at the coffee urn with 3 other men, a co-op grain buyer named Dale Beatty, a hardware dealer named Floyd Mossman, and a young Halverson Briggs surveyor whose name nobody could later remember. And he laughed and he pointed across the room at no one in particular. And he said loud enough that the women buying chick starter at the front register turned and looked, "Old man Pemberton thinks he's going to farm 14,400 tons of mine waste. He's got a 1948 Alice Chalmers and a copy of the Old Farmer's Almanac and a notebook from his granddad. The man is a museum exhibit, and he doesn't know it yet. Floyd Mossman laughed. Dale Beatty smiled the careful smile of a man who buys grain from his neighbors and does not laugh at them in public. Wendell Pemberton was, at that moment, 3/4 of a mile southwest of the feed store, standing at the south edge of the Slag field with a 9-pound sledgehammer in his right hand and his grandfather's notebook open in his left, and he was beginning the work. The procedure on page 31 of Thaddeus Pemberton's 1934 notebook was 4 steps long, written in a railroad clerk's pencil hand that sloped slightly to the right. Step 1 was to break the surface, not to remove it, not to bury it, but to break it. Thaddeus had used a 1918 Case 1225 steam tractor pulling a 4-foot iron Cambridge roller, weighted with 1,400 pounds of scrap pig iron, and he had crossed the dead lot back and forth at right angles for 11 weeks, until the clinker was reduced to fragments no larger than a hen's egg. The note said, "The rock will not stop the rain if the rain can pass between the rocks." Wendell Pemberton did not own a 1918 Case. He owned a 1948 Alice Chalmers WD, orange paint long since faded to the color of a peach left too long in the sun, with 6,200 hours on the original gasoline and distillate engine and a hand clutch his father had repaired with a brass shim in 1959. Behind the WD, he hitched a 5-foot Cambridge ring roller he had bought at a farm sale in Cherryvale in 1963 for $42, weighted with 12 broken cast-iron implement weights and 3 concrete blocks wired to the frame. The combined ground pressure under the rings was, by Wendell's own pencil calculation on the back of an envelope, 312 pounds per linear foot. It would not crush the slag in 1 pass. It would not crush it in 10. The next day, she sent the pail with their oldest son, Marvin Pemberton, age 38, who farmed his own 160 acres 4 miles north on Township Road 8. And Marvin had stood at the headland the same way and had watched 2 passes and had said nothing at all, and from that summer on the pail came every working day, sometimes with Ruth, sometimes with Marvin, sometimes with Marvin's wife Rachel, and the work continued. By the 4th week of the first pass, the WD's clutch began to slip on the long uphill rounds at the east end of the field, and Wendell pulled the bell housing in the equipment shed on the evening of the 11th of June. Replaced the throw-out bearing for $4.80 from the parts counter at the belfry implement, adjusted the linkage by 3/8 of an inch, and was back in the field by 6:14 the next morning. He kept a running tally in his grandfather's notebook on a fresh page he had added at the back, and at the close of the work on the 2nd of July, the tally read, 47 days, 517 hours, 138 gallons of regular gasoline at 36 cents the gallon, $49.68, and 1 throw-out bearing. The slag did not crush in the first pass. It did not crush in the second pass either. By the end of the 3rd pass, the 21st of August, 1972, the surface fragments were down to roughly the size of a man's thumb, and the dust kicked up behind the roller was no longer black, but was beginning to show a gray-brown haze where the iron pyrite was starting to weather under the August sun and the rain. In the 2nd week of September, Wendell drove the WD 14 miles north to the Calhoun Co-op in Belfry and bought 41 tons of agricultural lime. Pelletized dolomitic limestone, $9.40 a ton, $385.40 cash, paid out of a tin coffee can he had kept in the milk house since 1957. Wendell had read in a 1969 Kansas State Extension Service bulletin, the same agency Curtis Threadgill worked for, that mammoth red clover broadcast at 14 pounds per acre and inoculated with rhizobium bacteria would fix 134 pounds of nitrogen per acre per season under good moisture conditions, and would not fail under poor moisture conditions if the seed was placed well. He bought 880 pounds of mammoth red clover seed in March of 1973 from a Mennonite seed grower named Jonas Wentland at 34 cents a pound, $299.20 total, and broadcasted across the Slag field on the 24th of March, 1973, in a thin, cold rain. Curtis Threadgill drove past on the section road at 4:15 that afternoon, slowed his blazer, watched Wendell broadcasting clover seed across what every man in the county now called the Pemberton Dead Field, and drove on without stopping. The clover germinated, not all of it, roughly half of it, but the half that came up in patches that, by the end of June, were knee-high stands of dark green vegetation rooting down through the cracked slag and pulling up. Wendell would later have it tested at Kansas State for $11 per sample, 0.41% organic matter from a starting base of essentially zero. He mowed the clover at first bloom in July with a 7-foot John Deere sickle bar and let the cuttings lie. He mowed it again in September. He let the second cutting lie also. In October of 1973, 18 months after the first dump truck, Wendell Pemberton walked the south 63 acres with a hand auger and pulled 47 soil samples from a 4-inch depth and 47 samples from a 12-inch depth and packed them into glass jars and drove them himself to the soil testing lab at Kansas State in Manhattan. The pH at 4 inches had risen from 3.4 to 5.1. The pH at 12 inches had risen from 3.6 to 5.4. Organic matter at 4 inches stood at 0.71%. He had pulled a 1916 single-bottom Oliver-chilled steel plow 8 inches deep through the broken clinker in the spring of 1936, and behind that plow he had walked a single-row trench applicator of his own design that laid down a band of composted dairy manure mixed with green wood ash at a rate of 11 tons of compost and 400 pounds of ash per acre, directly into the furrow. And then he had closed the furrow with a single pass of a spike-tooth harrow. Wendell did not have a 1916 Oliver. He had a 1956 John Deere 45 two-bottom plow, which his father had bought new for $187, and behind it he rigged a homemade band applicator from sheet steel and an old Surge milker frame that delivered a 6-inch band of compost into the furrow at a rate he calibrated on the evening of April 14, 1974, in the barn by weighing 5 test charges on a hanging dairy scale. The compost came from his own dairy. He kept 31 Holsteins at that time, and he had been windrow composting the bedded pack from the milking parlor in 60-foot rows behind the equipment shed since 1961, turning it 3 times a year with a front-end loader he had bought, used in 1968, and on April 16th of 1974, he had 184 cubic yards of finished compost, dark brown, sweet-smelling, no recognizable straw, ready to spread. He plowed the south 63 acres in the third week of April 1974, banding compost as he went, and behind the plow on the next pass, he worked in another 22 tons of dolomitic lime and 1,100 pounds of high-calcium agricultural gypsum. The gypsum, a separate purchase, $74.80, from a supplier in Wichita. Step 4 on page 31 was the crop. Thaddeus had planted oats first in 1937, then winter wheat in the fall of 1937. Then in the spring of 1938, he had planted soybeans, and he had stayed in soybeans for 2 seasons before returning to wheat. The note read, "The soybean is a quiet crop. It asks little. It gives more than it asks. Follow the soybean." Wendell Pemberton planted 41 acres of Wayne soybeans on the 19th of May, 1974. Drilled at 8 pecks per acre with a 1962 John Deere 8,200 grain drill on 8-inch rows, and he planted 22 acres of oats on the same day on the rougher edge ground of the field. He cultivated nothing. He sprayed nothing. He walked the field on his Sunday afternoons in his work boots and turned his grandfather's notebook over in his hand at the end of each row. The 1974 harvest from the south 63 acres came off in October. The oats made 38 bushels per acre, which was within 2 bushels of the county average for unblighted ground. The Wayne soybeans, on what had been 38 inches of crushed slag 30 months earlier, made 27.4 bushels per acre on the 41 planted acres, which was 1.1 bushels above the Calhoun County average for that year. Wendell sold the soybeans at the Belfry Co-op for $5.94 a bushel. The check was for $6,679.50. He folded it in half and walked across the square to the Citizens State Bank and deposited it without saying a word about which acres it had come from. Eldon Calloway, the Calhoun Co-op manager who had sold him the lime in September of 1972, had been keeping his own quiet ledger in the back of the elevator office on a sheet of yellow legal pad. On the day Wendell delivered the 41 acres of Wayne's soybeans, the 19th of October, 1974, Eldon weighed the loads on the truck scale, ran the moisture and the foreign material on his Steinlight tester at 13.1% and 0.4% respectively, wrote the parcel description on the ticket as Pemberton South, 63 acres, and then walked out to the loading dock and stood for a full minute looking south down Main Street toward the courthouse with both hands in his pockets. He came back inside, took the lid off the chalkboard of grain prices on the back wall, erased the previous month's county average soybean yield, and wrote in a new figure with a steady right hand. He did not call Curtis Threadgill. He did not need to. In the Belfry feed and supply that same afternoon, Curtis Threadgill stood at the coffee urn and did not laugh. The 1975 season was an ordinary season. Wendell rotated the south field back into winter wheat in the fall of 1974 and harvested 36 bushels per acre off it in the summer of 1975, which was the county average. The 1976 season was an ordinary season. The south field made 39 bushels of winter wheat per acre, 1 bushel above the average. By the spring of 1977, 6 full years after the first Mack tandem had crossed the line, the south 63 acres of the Pemberton Place looked, from the section road, like every other field in eastern Calhoun County. Walked, it had a slightly darker tilth than the home north 80. The pH stood at 6.4. Where the neighboring fields, with 18 inches of good prairie loam over hard plow pan, had baked dry by the third week of July, the Pemberton South Field still had measurable soil moisture at 22 inches in the second week of August, twice the county average. On 63 acres that, by the math of every man in the Belfry feed store 5 years earlier, did not exist as agricultural ground. Curtis Threadgill drove out to the Pemberton place on the 14th of October, 1977. He parked the green Blazer at the gate, and he walked the south fence line on foot, alone, for 1 full hour. And then he walked up the lane to the barn, and he found Wendell Pemberton greasing the hubs of the 1948 Alice Chalmers WD with a hand-pump grease gun. "Mr. Pemberton," Curtis Threadgill said, and he was not holding a clipboard this time. He was holding his ball cap in both hands, the way a man holds his hat in a church. "I came out to apologize to you." Wendell Pemberton did not stop greasing the hub. He turned the wheel 1 quarter and pumped twice, and turned it another quarter and pumped twice. And then he straightened up, and he wiped his hands on a red shop rag, and he looked at Curtis Threadgill across 41 years of difference in age and 1,400 pounds of difference in what each man had carried. "Ain't nothing to apologize for, son," he said. "The work didn't need your permission. It just needed the time." He went back to the hub. Curtis Threadgill stood there for another minute, and then he walked back down the lane to the Blazer and drove away. And he did not come back to the Pemberton place again on county business or on any other business for the remaining 3 years of his appointment in Calhoun County. Wendell Pemberton kept farming the south 63 acres for another 14 years. The field never made less than the county average in any of those years, and exceeded it in 11 of them. "Page 31, Wendell said. "There's room at the bottom for what you learned that I didn't." Ezra Pemberton farmed the south 63 acres for the next 28 years, using the same rotation his great-great-grandfather Thaddeus had laid out in pencil in October of 1934, and his grandfather Wendell had proved out in the Slag and the drought between 1972 and 1977. In 2003, he added 2 pages to the notebook in blue ballpoint on the techniques he had developed for no-till seeding into the Slag-amended subsoil. In 2014, he added another page. In 2019, he handed the notebook to his own daughter, Hannah Pemberton, who was 22 years old and had just come home from Manhattan with a master's in soil science. The Halverson Briggs Mining Corporation closed its Calhoun County strip mine in November of 1981. The pit was reclaimed under federal law to a regrassed condition that by 2020 was still producing less than half the forage of any nearby unmined pasture. The 38-acre overburden disposal site directly west of the Pemberton South Field, the slag pile Halverson Briggs had kept on its own ground, was, as of the spring of 2024, still bare and gray at the surface, still measuring a pH of 3.7 in the topmost 6 inches, still classified by the state as permanently disturbed. The Pemberton South 63 acres in the spring of 2024 ran 41 bushels of winter wheat per acre under a 4th-generation rotation. A small, greasy pocket notebook with a red rubber band sat on the kitchen table of the same farmhouse, and its first page still read, in pencil that had not faded in 90 years, "The rock will not stop the rain if the rain can pass between the rocks." Some knowledge doesn't get louder When the world doubts it, it just waits.